Hello and welcome to the Discovering Sligo podcast. In this series, we're going to discover lots about the past and present of Sligo, from geology to archaeology, history, heritage, folklore, fishing, music, and more. Join me and my guests and my dog Lucky as we discover what Sligo has to offer. So hello and welcome to our first episode of the Discovering Sligo podcast. We're here in 3 Mailcoach Road, Sligo in our new studio, and I am delighted to be joined by my first ever guest on the podcast. It's Martin Byrne. Martin, you're very welcome.
Sally, thank you very much for having me.
Martin is a well-known tour guide. I think, Martin, you've probably been tour guiding for longer than I am alive at this stage, not to make you feel old. But Martin is very knowledgeable on many aspects of Sligo's past and currently works for the OPW Sligo Abbey. But it was back in Carramore in 2019 that I got to know Martin first, and we've spent many days in correspondence about many sites in Sligo. And I'm delighted to have you as the first guest on the show because today we're going back in time to the early beginnings in Sligo. The first peoples, who were the hunter-gatherers, and then also the arrival of the first farmers. Can you tell me a bit about what the landscape in Sligo would have been like over 10,000 years ago?
Sure. Well, you're looking at the end of the Ice Age. So the glaciers have retreated and they've left what you find in Sligo is a really fabulous landscape. You find these tabletop mountains like Benbulben and Knocknarea. You have the Brickleaf Mountains down in South Sligo where Carrowkeel is. You have Knocknarea, the Ballygawley Mountains. So all of these mountains are sculpted by the retreating glaciers at the end of the Ice Age. So we did think that the landscape was pretty empty for years, that there weren't people here. But Marion Dowd, who teaches in the IT in Sligo, discovered a few years ago a piece of worked bare bone down in County Clare, which I think pushed the Mesolithic people in Ireland back to something like 10,500 BC, or about 12,500 years ago. So we've had people in the island for at least that long. We don't have a great deal of evidence of people in this area, but we do have this fantastic landscape, heavily forested, really, really coastal landscape in Sligo. There would have been an abundance of wildlife here, lots of seafood. Just a really, really beautiful place.
So we still would have had the iconic Benbulben and Knocknarea shaped by the ice,
Yep.
but the sea level would have been much lower at that time. And as I said, the evidence is quite small for the hunter-gatherers. But tell me what their life would have been like here in Sligo. Would it have been a nice place to live as a hunter-gatherer?
Oh, I would think it would have been a fantastic place to live as a hunter-gatherer. And as we all know, anybody who lives in Sligo, I mean, it is the best part of Ireland to live in still, with the fantastic landscape.
Here.
But heavily forested landscape. There would have been an abundance of food. They tended to live, the Mesolithic people, in coastal areas. They did live inland as well, but they tended to seemingly, you find evidence of them in kind of like wetlands and river estuaries and things like that. So the closest actual Mesolithic evidence we have here in Sligo is Loch Garra. There's some cranogs, some kind of artificial platforms in the lakes down in Loch Garra. And Christina Friedengren, the archaeologist who's from Sweden, did some work down there back about 2 decades ago now. And that is the closest Mesolithic remains we have here in Sligo. But you can be sure there were people here. Their lifestyle and what they look like and their appearance, up until a few years ago, there was a lot of speculation about these things. But with the genetic revolution which took place in the last maybe 10 or 15 years, we have a huge amount more information about these people now. So...
And where did these people come from? And was Ireland an island at that stage?
The genetics tell us that the hunter-gatherers who came to Ireland originated in the southern Alps, so northern Italy. That's where their genetic signature can be traced back to. So as we said a few moments ago, they've been here about 12,500 years at least. And I'm not sure if Ireland was an island when they came here, but it certainly became an island fairly shortly afterwards. and they became quite an insular people. So they were kind of separated from the rest. Say the Mesolithic in England, I believe, is quite different to the Mesolithic in Ireland. There are a lot of it happens all the way through Irish history that people come here and they kind of adapt to the island life, and there's a kind of an insularity to it, but there's also these kind of trading and these connections with other countries as well.
And Sligo, of course, Sligo in Irish, the shelly place.
Yeah.
We have a lot of shell middens here in Sligo, and I'm hoping in a later episode to have Dr. Rory Connolly, who's one of his research interests is shell middens along the coast of Ireland. So I'm hoping to have him back to tell us more about what we might find if we were to excavate some of those here in Sligo. Now, my favourite part of the story of prehistory, particularly here in Sligo, is thinking about the interface between the Mesolithic, which is the Middle Stone Age, and the Neolithic. And this is something that we talk about a lot down at Carramore, and particularly myself, I'm interested in this. But what do you think that time was like when we have boats arriving in from France with a whole new technology, a new way of life, and how that integrated then or didn't with the existing population who had a different way of life, hunter-gatherer life?
Well, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is quite different to the Neolithic lifestyle. So the hunter-gatherers don't build monuments, they don't cut down trees, they don't farm, they don't keep livestock. They have quite a different, they have a kind of a semi-nomadic lifestyle. They camp, you find remains of graves, you find remains of fire pits, but they don't leave much other signature. And one of the main differences between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic is that the Mesolithic people tend to not alter the landscape in the way that the Neolithic people do. So we had great conversations about this in Carramore over the years, and it's like a colonization. It's kind of like you can imagine people in the land, and you can imagine fleets of boats arriving, and it's very interesting because it's one of the things we have a lot of in Irish mythology. We have 5 waves of colonization in Irish mythology, and I really do wonder if the genetic information that we're getting nowadays, some of that is possibly recorded in some of our mythology. But basically, you see ships arriving on the horizon, your hunter-gatherers are there doing whatever it is you do, they're fishing. So you have this wonderful landscape, and you have surely Mesolithic people living in it, and then ships start arriving. And the earliest evidence we have in Ireland of farmers arriving is a place called Ferreter's Cove down in Kerry, and that's the first place they found evidence of a domesticated cow, and that is about 4,350 BC, or 6,350 years ago. There was a cow slaughtered and dismembered on a beach down in Kerry, and some people tend to think that that is the remains of a shipwreck of an early attempt at farmers to colonise Ireland. So they're coming from at least that distance back in time. They seem to be coming from the Brittany area in France. We don't have direct proof of that yet, but we do have similar monuments here in Sligo, 2 monuments that you find in France. For some reason, they come right up the west coast, and they seem to be the biggest landfalls, and the biggest collections of megaliths are found in this Sligo area. We don't know for sure why that is. I know some people believe that they came up through the Irish Sea and that they came right around the north coast. I don't know, that would seem like 3 times the distance. Difficult to imagine really, or visualize. Trying to imagine their journey coming by ship in these hide covered boats. I mean, they're bringing livestock with them, they're bringing domesticated cattle, they're bringing sheep, they're bringing goats, possibly bringing pigs. We believe that they're bringing red deer with them, and that they reintroduce red deer to Ireland. So you're looking at a culture clash basically of some kind. It's hard to say for sure, do the Mesolithic people welcome them? Mesolithic people, there's different estimates for how many were living in the country at the time of the Neolithic colonization. I do remember hearing a figure of 10 or 12,000 people, a total population in Ireland at that time.
Yeah, that was for the whole island of Ireland.
The whole island.
Maybe it was a little bit bigger with lower sea levels, but that's, the population of Sligo, I think, is 56,000 or something.
Yeah.
But hopefully in time to come we will find more evidence of those Mesolithic people. Martin, yourself and myself live very close to a megalithic tomb. In my case, the Clockcur Portal tomb on Leo Layden's farm, and you're very near to Creevy Keel Court tomb. but both of those are different forms of tombs, and there are 4 forms of megalithic tomb at least that we know of in Ireland today. Can you tell us a little bit about each of those individually, and maybe a little bit of one or two that you like in particular in the county?
Well, yeah, megaliths are absolutely fascinating monuments. Now, one of the things you find about them is that people tend to gravitate towards megaliths and not look at other aspects of Neolithic life because they're big and impressive monuments. Sligo is an incredibly rich area for these monuments, and you find all of the kinds of megaliths that you find in the country you can find in Sligo. It's most famous for its passage graves, which is Carrowkeel, Carrowmore, Queen Maeve's Cairn. But you also have, I can't remember the exact number, but court cairns, which is Creevykeel, which is close to where I live. Court cairns are a different style of monument built by possibly a different group of farmers. We know now from the genetics that these people are mostly originating in ancient Anatolia, which is modern Turkey, that they're migrating, the passage grave people are migrating through the Mediterranean by ship. They're coming around the coast of Spain, they're coming up through France, and they're coming to these islands. You have the court cairn people, which is the other major group of megaliths that you find, and they seem to have originated in the same area, but they seem to have migrated across the land. They went up through Greece, up through the Balkans, followed the route of the Danube, and they all meet again in France about 1500 years later, and that's where megalithism, as you might call it, originates. So it's very interesting to see that when they come to this country, that you find these various different styles of megaliths, different types, but we don't know exactly what the differentiation between them is. So the 4 kinds would be passage graves, court tombs or court cairns, portal dolmens, which are our famous dolmens like Pool-na-Brone, and the 4th kind are the youngest, which are the wedge tombs, and they seem to be built by the Bronze Age people.
So in Sligo we have this fantastic concentration of tombs. Is there any reason you think that they pick Sligo in particular for this? Is it the landscape? Is it the abundance of good agricultural land? These are farmers after all. Is it the type of rocks that we've got up here, or just being in the best part of the world?
Well, resources would have to be a part of it for sure. Back maybe 20 or 25 years ago, archaeologists used to think that they came here for the abundance of shellfish, and that has been overturned now by the genetic revolution, because any genetic information we have about the Neolithic farmers tells us that fish was not a part of their diet. So that one is out, and shell middens are probably out for the Neolithic as well, much more of a Mesolithic. Shell middens, by the way, tend to date from the Mesolithic to the Middle Ages, but they don't find so many of them in the Neolithic as far as I'm aware. And a lot of the ones we have around Sligo seem to be from the Bronze Age to the Middle Ages.
And one of the bigger debates too about megalithic tombs is that, you know, are these the higher class people in their society that are, you know, having a specialised diet, that they're having a protein rich diet from the land, and then maybe the lesser people who maybe didn't get buried in tombs like these portal or court tombs or passage tombs, that maybe they were buried elsewhere in caves or on mountain tops or thrown out to sea. Maybe those people did eat from the sea or had a different way of life to the higher ups in the society. It's something I often think about. Yeah,
that's one of the things for sure. People, monuments, a lot of people get excited and upset about the idea of monuments being burial places, because some monuments you don't find any bodies in, and that seems to be specifically related to the type of landscape where they're built in. So here in Sligo, we're in a limestone landscape, and that tends to preserve the bones that were placed in the monuments very, very well. You don't find bones preserved quite so well in granite landscapes. So some certain parts of Ireland have monuments where no human remains were found. But as you're saying, it's only a tiny fragment of the population that were actually buried in these monuments. They were for a specific type of person within the Neolithic, and we have not really got a clue why that was. Now, the modern genetic research has seemed to indicate that there was an elite. They talk about in some of the papers a dynastic elite. They have discovered that people buried in Carrowmore, Carrowkeel, a person in Newgrange, and people up in Northern Ireland, up on the Ards Peninsula, were all related, that they were part of one extended family, so possibly a ruling family. But we really don't have enough information to be able to say what was the story with the other people in the society.
Before I let you go, I know that you're very interested in researching into the folklore of many of these tombs here in Sligo. Is there any particular stories that you want to share that you think are very interesting for those maybe who've never visited some of these sites? Maybe they're not even from Sligo.
One of the things we used to talk about a lot in Carrowmore was the Cailleach, or the witch. And in a lot of the local folklore, particularly where you find passage graves, you find stories about this powerful multitasking woman who is the monument builder. So here in Sligo, we have a monument up in the mountains called Cailleach Avira's house, and she is the lady who, in the local folklore, who built all of the monuments. The more modern, she's become a hag in a lot of local folklore stories, but this seems to be a kind of a memory of possibly the goddess of the Neolithic farmers. And it's fascinating that you find so many stories about this powerful female entity or spirit associated with these monuments. You have it in Carrowmore. You don't particularly have it so much in Carrowkeel, but you do have it in the caves of Keshcorran. And this lady is she's said to have control over the seasons, over the weather. She has a magic apron, and she carries stones in her apron and throws the stones across the landscape. And this is how the monuments are said to be formed in some of the stories. So I'm very, very fond of that story. But as we said earlier on, Sligo is an absolutely fantastic part of the world, and it has so much archaeology, such a wonderful landscape, fantastic traditional music, but it's also one of the best parts of Ireland for mythology. And one of my favourite aspects of the local mythology is the first and second Battle of Moytura. And these are stories depicting waves of colonisation coming here to the country, to Ireland. And as I've said earlier, it may well be some kind of a remnant of a memory of these Stone Age farmers arriving. So traditionally, the first Battle of Moytura takes place in Cong down in the Galway-Mayo border. And the second battle takes place in Sligo, down by Lough Arrow. But there is some really interesting ideas that both battles originally took place in Sligo, and that the first Battle of Moytura took place on the beaches down between Ballastadair and Beltra. And I am absolutely fascinated by this, that it was a kind of a mistranslation in a medieval manuscript led to Cong becoming the place. So again, I think Sligo should really be claiming both the first and second battles of Moytura.
We'll definitely claim that one anyway, Martin. So, you know, as the sea level rose coming into the Bronze Age period, very likely some of our tombs could well be underwater in both Sligo Bay and Ballastadair Bay, which is another potential research strategy going forward for some keen archaeology student out there. Or we might take it to the boat ourselves someday and revisit. Martin, I also wanted to talk to you about your online activity at the moment. You have a fantastic Facebook group going on at the moment. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I've been interested in online since the late 1990s, and I have a website which I put up, and it's been evolving since I think 1997 or 1998. So I've been fascinated by the online presence and how you can communicate with people. And then Facebook has been around for about, I suppose, nearly 15 years now, and it can be really annoying, but it's a wonderful resource, and it's a wonderful way of communicating with people. So just over a year ago, I started a group called the Irish Megalithic Research Group. And it was a kind of an informal place for people to discuss various topics, not to be too academic. Irish archaeology and Irish culture is pretty complex. So for people from other countries, it can be difficult enough to get a grasp on things. So we have a pretty interesting forum with a lot of debate and things go on. There's nearly 22,000 people have joined in the last 12 months, so it's quite a busy site. So I'm one of the moderators in the group, and thoroughly enjoy it. Very interesting.
Hopefully there'll be another 22,000 after this episode of the podcast as well. So do go and join up to Martin's group and enjoy the hotly debated topics that are out there. Newgrange is a number one topic, and I am hoping to have Michael Gibbons on one of our upcoming episodes of this podcast as well. Michael is going to talk about the upland prehistoric sites around the Glenade Valley area. So that will be an interesting podcast to watch out for as well. And another way for people to find out about your research, Martin, is to have a look at your website, which is www.carrowkeel.com.
That's it.
And if they want to get in contact with you about anything, you can find an email for Martin there. Thank you very much to Martin for joining me on the very first episode of the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's probably been a little bit of a deep archaeological dive into the Mesolithic and Neolithic of County Sligo. But we are hoping that you'll join us again for episodes and that Martin will be back to talk to us about another interest of his, which is Father O'Flanagan, who, fun fact for the day, he was the inventor of the
modern swimming goggles.
There you go. So that's one to watch out for as well in the future. So Martin, you'll definitely be back and we look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Sally.
So folks, that brings us to the end of our first episode of the Discovering Sligo podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the first interview with Martin Byrne, where we talked about the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods of time in Sligo's past. And it's only a little hint of what's to come on the podcast. Do stay tuned. Make sure you like and follow and share and subscribe to all of our platforms that this podcast is available and our social media pages. So if you would like to support this podcast in any way, you can support it for free by giving it a share online, or if you want to give us a financial contribution, you can do so by getting in contact with me via those Facebook pages. Just look for Discovering Sligo Podcast. And then there is another way, which is kind of funny, because it's called buymeacoffee.com, and if you look for Sally Siggins on that page, or the links are on the social medias as well, you can sponsor me €5 or €10 to buy a couple of coffees. Funny part is that I don't actually drink coffee, but nonetheless it's a great way of supporting what I'm trying to do here in a small way, which means a lot to me. A big thank you to the folks at Recenter Community here on Mailcoach Road for allowing us the use of their building for our studio for these podcast series. So thank you very much, thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode.